The room didn't erupt, it froze. Cameras kept rolling as the words landed, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the air like glass. A single sentence, dismissive, smug, loaded with history, was enough to redraw the power lines in the room. You could see it on faces in the audience. Disbelief first, then anger, then something heavier. This wasn't just another televised debate moment. This was an insult wrapped in authority, aimed squarely at identity, belonging, and worth. The antagonist leaned back, confident, certain the moment belonged to them. They smirked, expecting applause or at least silence. Instead, silence became judgment. Somewhere off camera, producers shifted. Social feeds lit up in real time. Clips were being saved before the sentence even finished echoing. And then the camera cut to the hero. Calm, still, eyes forward, no interruption, no flinch, just restraint. In that pause, those few seconds that felt like minutes, the country collectively held its breath. Because everyone knew what was coming next wouldn't just answer an insult. It would expose something deeper. And once it started, there would be no rewinding the moment that changed everything. What followed would ripple across screens, streets, and hearts, demanding attention, courage, and an unavoidable reckoning for all. Moments like this don't just happen on television, they happen inside a country's conscience. The remark wasn't a slip. It was a signal about who is allowed to belong, who must explain themselves, and who gets to decide the rules of dignity. In an election season already burning with anxiety, the line drew a bright border between power and people, between comfort and consequence. For millions of immigrants and children of immigrants, the sting was immediate. They've heard it before in classrooms, courtrooms, and comment sections, dressed up as policy or just a joke. Tonight, it arrived with a microphone and a seal of legitimacy. That's why this exchange mattered more than ratings. It tested whether public life still had room for truth spoken without permission. Politically, the clash threatened a fragile balance. One side banked on dominance, believing outrage would fade by morning. The other carried something heavier: lived experience, receipts, and an understanding that silence has costs. Morally, the moment demanded a choice from everyone watching: shrug and scroll, or recognize the familiar pattern and reject it. Across the country, phones buzzed. Group chats filled. Hashtags formed. People who rarely agree found common ground in the discomfort. Because when identity is reduced to a punchline, neutrality becomes complicity. And when arrogance goes unchallenged, it grows. This was the instant where a debate stopped being theater and became a referendum on values. The question wasn't who won the exchange. It was who would be exposed when the calm response finally arrived, and whether the truth would land softly or hit with the force to change everything. Because the next moments would reveal who had mistaken confidence for power, who mistook cruelty for strength, and why the answer, once spoken, would refuse to stay confined to that room or this country's future itself. They didn't arrive at that moment by accident. The antagonist's rise was built on polish, access, and a carefully maintained image of authority that rarely tolerated challenge. Years of sound bites and panels had trained them to dominate rooms, to speak over nuance, to mistake volume for virtue. They learned early that certainty sells, especially when it flatters the powerful and simplifies the world into winners and outsiders. Publicly, they preached fairness, opportunity, and common sense. Privately, their record told a more selective story. Policies supported in daylight contradicted the empathy claimed at night. They praised diversity in theory while mocking it in practice. When confronted, they dismissed critics as overly sensitive, framing accountability as censorship. It was a pattern: deny, deflect, move on, one that had worked because consequences rarely followed. Arrogance crept in quietly. Each unchallenged moment reinforced the belief that they were untouchable, that credentials could substitute for character. They spoke about immigrants as abstractions, numbers to be managed, problems to be solved. Never neighbors, never colleagues, never equals. That distance made cruelty easier, almost invisible to them, wrapped in rhetoric that sounded reasonable if you didn't look too closely. Behind the scenes, producers knew the formula: provoke, posture, provoke again. Conflict meant clicks, and the antagonist delivered reliably. They mistook the platform for permanence, the applause for agreement. What they didn't see was the slow erosion beneath their feet, the audience growing sharper, less forgiving, more attuned to hypocrisy than ever before. Because history has a way of catching up with people who confuse dominance with truth. Every contradiction leaves a trace. Every dismissive laugh plants a seed of doubt. And in moments like this, when the spotlight burns hotter and the room refuses to play along, those traces begin to surface. The very confidence that once protected them now magnified their flaws. What once passed as strength started to look like fragility. And as the camera lingered, it became clear that the armor they trusted was thinner than they believed, ready to crack the second someone spoke back with calm, clarity, and an unignorable truth. They had built their career on control of the narrative, never imagining the narrative could turn. Tonight, the script was slipping. The pause, the silence, the watching audience, all of it signaled an approaching reversal, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that ends reputations quietly, permanently, in plain sight with nowhere left to hide. Long before the cameras found them, the protagonist learned what it meant to stand quietly and endure. Their story didn't begin in a studio or a courtroom, but in borrowed spaces, translated conversations, and the constant awareness of being watched yet unseen. They grew up navigating two worlds at once, mastering the art of code switching before they ever learned the word for it. Nothing was handed to them easily. Opportunity came wrapped in paperwork, skepticism, and the unspoken demand to prove belonging again and again. They watched their parents work longer hours for less recognition, teaching resilience without speeches. Sacrifice wasn't dramatic, it was routine, missed celebrations, delayed dreams, the quiet agreement that survival came first. Still, they believed in the promise they were told this country made, not blindly but deliberately. They studied harder, listened closer, and learned how systems actually worked. Public service wasn't a slogan to them. It was a responsibility earned through effort and accountability. When doors stayed closed, they knocked politely, persistently, until the sound could no longer be ignored. What set them apart wasn't anger, though they had reason for it. It was restraint. They understood that dignity could be strategic, that composure unsettled people who relied on chaos. Over time, they built a reputation for preparation, for knowing the details others waved away. Facts became armor. Empathy became leverage. They carried stories with them into every room, the neighbor helped by a policy change, the family protected by a vote, the student who finally felt seen. These weren't talking points. They were reminders of why silence was never an option. Each encounter sharpened their sense of purpose, grounding them when pressure mounted. So when the insult came, it didn't surprise them. It confirmed something they'd known for years. Moments like this were inevitable. The difference was readiness. This wasn't just about defending themselves. It was about defending everyone who had been talked over, laughed at, or reduced to a stereotype. In that pause on camera, the hero wasn't deciding whether to respond. They were deciding how much truth the room could handle and whether the country was ready to hear it. Because this confrontation was never about ego. It was about memory, lineage, and the promise passed forward. Every step of their journey had prepared them for resistance disguised as authority. They knew the weight of representation, the cost of mistakes, and the power of speaking with care. As the lights hummed overhead, they steadied themselves, understanding that what they said next could echo far beyond the room, challenging narratives, unsettling comfort, and reminding a watching nation who truly belongs. The moment waited, heavy, irreversible, demanding courage before consequence, and history leaned closer now. The shift was subtle at first, almost polite. Voices stayed measured, but the air thickened as questions sharpened and answers grew defensive. The antagonist leaned forward now, abandoning the casual posture that once signaled control. Their words came faster, layered with sarcasm, repeating points already challenged. It was the tell of someone unused to resistance, pushing harder when the room stopped yielding. The hero didn't interrupt. They listened, eyes steady, letting the contradictions stack themselves. Each pause forced the antagonist to keep talking, to explain further, to dig. What had sounded clever minutes earlier began to unravel under its own weight. The audience felt it, the imbalance growing, the rhythm changing. This was no longer a performance, it was pressure. A comment meant to dismiss landed flat. A laugh went unanswered. The antagonist glanced toward the moderator, then back again, searching for rescue in procedure or time. Instead, the clock kept moving. The camera lingered. Silence did more damage than any rebuttal could have. Meanwhile, the hero stayed anchored. Their calm wasn't passive, it was deliberate. They asked a single clarifying question, simple and precise, the kind that leaves no room to hide. The antagonist stumbled through a response, circling, hedging, contradicting themselves mid-sentence. The authority they relied on began to fracture in real time. Viewers at home felt the tension tighten like a wire. Social feeds refreshed with disbelief. People recognized the moment when bluster meets accountability. The hero's restraint became a mirror, reflecting the antagonist's agitation back at them. Every raised eyebrow, every rushed explanation made the contrast impossible to ignore. This was the turning of the tide, though it wasn't announced. It revealed itself in body language, in breath, in the way confidence drained from one voice and settled into another. The confrontation had shifted from attack to exposure. And as the antagonist spoke again, louder but less certain, it became clear they had already lost control of the narrative. What remained was the reckoning, still coming, still building, waiting for the sentence that would finally make it undeniable. The room sensed it, and the audience leaned closer together now. The hero finally spoke, not louder but slower, and the room leaned in. They thanked the moderator, acknowledged the tension, and then did something unexpected. They named the insult without repeating it. By refusing to echo the language, they stripped it of power. "Let's be precise," they said, and precision became the blade. They laid out facts calmly, one by one, each grounded in records, votes, and timelines the antagonist had hoped no one remembered. Immigration numbers were contextualized, not weaponized. Policies were traced from promise to outcome. The narrative shifted from opinion to evidence, and you could feel the air move as certainty changed sides. A pause followed, not for effect but to let truth settle. The hero looked up, meeting the antagonist's eyes, and asked a question that carried moral weight. Who benefits when fear replaces facts? The room stayed quiet. Cameras caught the antagonist blinking, adjusting their mic, glancing away. Confidence evaporated under scrutiny. The hero continued, voice steady, acknowledging complexity without surrendering clarity. They spoke about families, labor, service, and taxes paid quietly for years. They connected policy to people without pleading. The message was simple and devastating. Dignity is not conditional, and belonging is not granted by someone else's approval. Another pause. A breath. The hero invited the audience to consider their own neighbors, teachers, nurses, coworkers. Suddenly, the abstraction collapsed. The antagonist attempted to interrupt, but the moderator raised a hand. The rules, for once, held. As the hero finished, they returned to the original claim and dismantled it gently, showing how it contradicted the antagonist's own past statements. The receipts were clean, dates aligned, quotes matched. The screen behind them filled with proof. Murmurs spread. A quiet gasp rippled through the room. The antagonist tried to recover, offering a half-smile and a joke that landed nowhere. Their shoulders tightened. Their answers shortened. What had been swagger now looked like strain. The audience could see it, authority crumbling without a shout. The hero closed with a line that wasn't sharp but final. They affirmed love for the country without qualifiers, honoring struggle as a source of strength, not suspicion. "We don't need permission to belong," they said, "because we've been here contributing all along." Silence followed, heavy and unmistakable. Not applause yet, recognition, the kind that rewrites a room. In that stillness, the antagonist understood what had happened. The narrative had turned, the mask had slipped, and the moment was no longer theirs to control. The reckoning had arrived, and it would not be undone. Outside the room, the reaction had already begun to swell, unseen but unstoppable. Screens captured the pause, the proof, the composure, and shared it faster than spin could catch up. Viewers recognized themselves in the restraint, felt relief in the clarity, and sensed a line being crossed back into truth. Commentators hesitated, recalibrating. Allies exhaled. Critics searched for angles and found none that fit. The moment refused distortion. It carried a gravity that doesn't trend and vanish but settles. As the hero lowered their gaze, the future of the exchange crystallized. Whatever came next, denial would sound hollow, outrage would feel staged, and the consequences would begin to spread. History watched, quietly counting costs, choosing memory over noise, and preparing consequences ahead. Within minutes, the clip escaped the room and found its audience. Phones buzzed, timelines refreshed, and a single paused frame of composure began circulating faster than commentary could form. Captions varied, but the message stayed the same. Something irreversible had happened. The exchange wasn't edited, softened, or reframed. It stood on its own, and people recognized it instantly. Hashtags surged, unplanned and organic. Immigrant communities shared it with quiet pride. Allies reposted with relief. Even skeptics watched twice, expecting a trap that never appeared. The hero's restraint became shorthand for credibility, their words quoted without embellishment. Meanwhile, the antagonist's smirk froze into a meme that told a different story than intended. Cable panels scrambled. Pundits who usually shouted spoke carefully now, choosing words like miscalculation and overreach. A few tried to spin outrage into strength, but the footage resisted it. The facts were clean, the tone was measured. Attempts at distraction only amplified the contrast viewers already felt in their gut. Public opinion shifted not with fireworks but with alignment. Polls ticked. Comment sections softened. People who rarely comment wrote long messages about feeling seen. Teachers played the clip in classrooms. Organizers forwarded it in group chats, calling it proof that calm can win. The moment became a reference point, a shared language for dignity. The antagonist released a statement hours later, defensive and vague. It landed flat. Replies outpaced it instantly, stacked with timestamps and quotes. The narrative had moved on without permission. What once felt dominant now felt dated. Across the country, conversations changed tone. Dinner tables, offices, buses. The insult that started it all lost power, replaced by the response that answered it. The hero hadn't just won an exchange. They'd altered the temperature of the room beyond it. As night settled, views climbed, clips multiplied, and reactions kept arriving. The story refused to slow. Something had shifted beneath the noise, and everyone sensed it. This wasn't the end of the confrontation. It was the beginning of consequences. By morning, headlines followed sentiment, not the other way around. Editorials softened. Apologies appeared unconvincing. Donations spiked. Voters registered. The clip crossed borders, translated without losing meaning. Pride replaced fatigue. Momentum built quietly, relentlessly, toward a reckoning no strategist could pause, reroute, outrun, or delay. As institutions prepared responses and audiences waited for what accountability would demand next from leaders, platforms, and voters everywhere as pressure continued building nationwide. What lingered after the noise faded wasn't victory, but clarity. The exchange revealed a truth larger than any personality. Dignity does not ask permission, and belonging is not a favor granted by power. When fear is confronted with facts and contempt meets composure, the moral math changes. The country saw itself not as it argues, but as it chooses. This reckoning wasn't about perfect heroes or permanent villains. It was about patterns finally interrupted. For generations, identity had been used as a wedge, a shortcut to dominance. That night, restraint broke the pattern. Calm became courage. Evidence became empathy. The lesson traveled faster than outrage ever could. Strength is measured by who you protect, not who you exclude. People felt the shift because it mirrored their own lives. The long hours, the careful words, the quiet pride of contribution without applause. The hero's response validated those experiences without romanticizing them. It said plainly, you count. Your work counts. Your story counts. And no insult can erase that truth once it's spoken aloud. Justice, the moment reminded us, is not a spectacle, it's a practice. It shows up in how we listen, how we respond, how we refuse to mirror cruelty. The antagonist's collapse wasn't humiliation, it was exposure. The mask slipped because the values underneath couldn't hold. In contrast, the hero's steadiness wasn't strategy alone, it was alignment between belief and action. As the meaning settled, the room gave way to something rarer than applause: resolve. Viewers didn't just agree, they committed. To speak with care, to challenge lies without becoming them, to carry dignity forward when provoked. This was the emotional crest, the moment when a nation remembers that identity is not a weakness to defend, but a strength to stand on. And with that recognition, the story moved toward its final question. What will we do with the clarity we've been given? Because clarity demands action, accountability follows attention, and tomorrow tests whether courage lasts beyond applause, beyond screens, beyond comfort, and into choices that shape laws, lives, and legacies together now.